She promised to marry whoever tamed her wild horse. But a beggar succeeds. The promise left Savannah's mouth on an afternoon of heavy sun in the middle of Main Street, with half the town as witness. She hadn't planned to say it, but she did. Whoever tames Midnight, I'll marry. 6 words, just that short, and the weight of them took about 2 days to truly sink in. Before anyone could catch their breath, Midnight bucked hard, threw the saddle to the side, and jumped the fence as if the wood were paper. The man trying to mount him sat on the ground, covered in dust, mouth open, arms still spread in the air, as if he hadn't understood what had happened. The people around laughed. Savannah didn't. She turned her back and walked away without looking anywhere, brown hat pulled forward, hands in her jean pockets, jaw clenched. Inside, she was trembling. The problem wasn't what people would say. The problem was that she knew better than anyone there that Black Horse wouldn't let anyone get close, that Midnight had thrown the best ranch hands in the region as if they were children, and that she, in a moment of anger, had just placed her own life in the middle of a challenge she had no certainty anyone would win. The Miller Ranch sat on the outskirts of town, on an open plain the sun beat down on since early morning. Savannah had grown up there, had learned to ride before she learned to write, and could tell the smell of rain before it fell. Her father, Mr. Arthur, had been a man of few words and a lot of land. He had left the world 2 years before, quiet as he was, leaving the ranch, some financial loose ends, and Midnight. Midnight was a stallion black as coal, with a mane that seemed to have a life of its own, eyes that sized everything up before moving. Mr. Arthur had bought the animal as a colt, at a cattle fair far from there, and spent the last years of his life trying to understand him, not tame him, not break him. Understand. It was different, but he hadn't even fully managed that. The horse understood what he wanted to understand and did what he wanted to do. When Mr. Arthur passed, Midnight became even more skittish, as if he had realized he'd lost the only human being he truly tolerated. Savannah had inherited the horse, the ranch, and the responsibility of handling it all alone. She was 28 years old, long dark hair, brown eyes that didn't waver easily, and a firmness in her walk that made people think twice before questioning any decision she made. But inside, underneath all of that, no one saw how exhausted she was. It wasn't from work, it was from everything else, from Harrison Brooks, mainly. Harrison was the most influential man around, son of a rancher, grandson of a rancher, owner of some 3 properties, and of the annoying certainty that the world owed him anything he wanted. He was 35, wore good leather boots, and had a smile Savannah found falser than a promise of rain in August. Since Mr. Arthur had passed, Harrison showed up at the ranch every week with different pretexts, bringing something he claimed her father had left at his house, offering help with the financial loose ends, proposing partnerships that were, deep down, subtle ways of slowly swallowing up what was hers. He wanted the ranch, and along with it, for convenience, he wanted Savannah. She knew it. Mrs. Martha knew it. Even the ranch's old dog seemed to know, because he barked every time Harrison's car came down the dirt road. Mrs. Martha was Savannah's aunt, Mr. Arthur's older sister, who had moved to the ranch after her brother passed, to help her niece not be alone in the world. She was 64 years old, white hair pinned up in a high bun, hands calloused from decades of work, and a mind that sized people up with a precision that sometimes frightened those who didn't know her well. She didn't make much noise, didn't like direct confrontation, but she had a way of putting her finger right on the wound that hurt differently from any open criticism. You need someone by your side, she'd tell Savannah every now and then. But not that one. The problem was that Savannah didn't want any of the men who showed up at the ranch pretending to be interested in her when their real interest was in the land. And it was in that mood, on that particular day, when Harrison had just made yet another proposal disguised as kindness, and she had turned him down for the 10th time, that the words slipped out. Savannah was leaving the corral when she heard Midnight acting up once again inside the pen. Harrison, wanting to show off his power as he always did, said he could tame that beast in 10 minutes. He had the tone of someone who had already decided he was going to win before he even started. Savannah looked at him with that firmness in her brown eyes and said, almost without thinking, "If you tame Midnight, I'll marry you." She thought he'd back down. He didn't. He tried. Midnight sent him flying in less than a minute, and without meaning to, Savannah had opened up a challenge for the whole town of Abilene. In the following days, 8 different men showed up trying their luck with the stallion. 2 left limping. 1 was carried off with an injured arm. A 4th couldn't even get close to the animal before Midnight bared his teeth and backed away in a way that made it clear what would happen if the man took one more step. The other 4 left with their pride more bruised than their bodies. Midnight threw everyone off with an ease that almost seemed like satisfaction. Savannah watched it all from the porch, her face serious, the brown hat on her head, the red shirt she usually wore on days when there was a lot to handle. Inside, she was slowly relaxing. Maybe no one would manage it. Maybe the promise would stay just a promise, forgotten over time, and life would go on as it was. But then Colton showed up. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. He arrived on a Wednesday morning when the dust on the road was still settled and the sun hadn't reached its peak. No one knew where he came from. He showed up at the ranch gate with a backpack slung over his shoulder, clothes worn from a lot of walking, boots with scuffed leather, and a way of standing still that contrasted with all of that. He was in his early 30s, with about 5 days of beard growth, a dark and quiet gaze of someone who had seen a lot without having asked to see it. One of the ranch hands went over to him. The man asked if there was work. He didn't ask for a favor, didn't spin stories. He asked for work. Savannah was called to decide. She looked at him from a distance first, the way she had of sizing people up before letting them in. Then she approached with her usual steady stride. "So, what do you know how to do?" she asked. "I know how to work the land and I know how to work with animals," he replied. His voice was low, direct, no beating around the bush. She was silent for a moment. There wasn't much work to spare, but there was the corral to clean and some fence repairs she had let pile up. "You can stay for today," she said. "We'll see later." She didn't ask his name right away. He didn't offer it. It was only later, when Mrs. Martha went to bring him water near dusk, that the aunt came back with the information. "The young man's name is Colton. He's not from around here." That information at that moment seemed to mean nothing, but Savannah kept it in her head without being able to explain why. Colton worked that day without making more noise than necessary. He cleaned the corral with a care that Savannah noticed from the office window. It wasn't the work of someone trying to impress. It was the work of someone who was used to doing things right because that was just how he did them. She called him at the end of the day. "You're coming back tomorrow?" It wasn't a question. He nodded. It was 2 days later that Midnight said something. Savannah was on the other side of the fence checking some loose boards when she saw Colton standing near the animal. Not inside the pen, just leaning against the fence, on the outside. Midnight was restless as always, stomping his hoof on the ground, tossing his head from side to side. But Colton didn't back away. He didn't make any movement. He stood still, shoulders low, his breathing visible only through the movement of his chest. He stayed like that for a long time, so long that Savannah thought she should call him before the horse got truly irritated. Then Midnight stopped moving. Savannah held her breath. The horse took a step toward Colton, then another, slowly. Then Colton raised his hand with an almost imperceptible slowness, unhurried, silent, and let Midnight's muzzle touch his fingers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She couldn't move for a good while. There are things you see and know you can't explain. That was one of them. That same day she went up to Colton and asked directly, as was her way, "How did you do that?" He considered the question for a moment. Then he gave a slight shrug. "I didn't do anything. I just stayed." Savannah kept looking at him. Just staying isn't that simple. For someone in a hurry, it isn't. But this horse doesn't need force. He needs someone who doesn't want anything from him right away. She thought about that for days. In the following days, Colton and Midnight came to understand each other in a way that seems impossible when you describe it in words, but that you see and believe. The horse ate from his hand. He let his neck be touched. He stayed quiet when Colton spoke softly near his ear. And on a Saturday morning, with the light still low and the ranch waking up, Colton saddled Midnight with calm movements, mounted carefully, and the horse stood still. He let himself be led. He obeyed. The news spread through Abilene that very day. Before lunch, everyone already knew. Harrison showed up at the ranch that afternoon, his face grim, his usual 2 men behind him. He still didn't quite understand what had happened, because he thought that man in worn-out clothes couldn't be the same one people were talking about. "Who is this ranch hand?" he asked Savannah. "A worker," she answered, short like that. "Any ordinary worker doesn't tame Midnight out of nowhere. There's some explanation you're not giving me." Savannah looked at him with a calm that on the inside was no calm at all. "What has no explanation is you coming in here uninvited for the 3rd time this week, Harrison." He left, but she knew he would come back with more questions, and she had her own question to resolve, one much bigger than Harrison's, the promise. She had said it in front of everyone. And Colton had tamed Midnight. Did her word mean anything or not? Savannah Miller had grown up hearing her father say that the family name was the only thing no one could buy, that a pledged word had the weight of stone. But marry a man she barely knew? Someone who carried a worn-out backpack and had no address at all? She went to talk to Mrs. Martha that night. Her aunt was in the kitchen, stirring a pot with that concentration of someone doing one thing while thinking about another. Savannah came in, sat in her usual chair and stayed silent for a moment. Mrs. Martha didn't wait for her to ask. "You already know what you have to do. The question is whether you have the courage to find out more before you decide." "I don't know anything about him," Savannah said. "Then find out. Before you say yes or no, find out who he really is." "Not what he seems now." Savannah went to sleep without resolving anything, but it stayed on her mind all night. The next day she went to talk to Colton. He was in the corral brushing Midnight with that slow, careful way of someone who has true patience. Savannah walked up and got straight to the point. "Everyone knows about the promise. You know about it too because I heard you mention it to one of the ranch hands, so I need to know who you are." Colton stopped moving the brush, turned to her, that same dark, quiet look as always. "I didn't come here because of the promise," he said. "Then why did you come?" "Because I needed work. Everything else just happened." Savannah waited. Colton gave a slight nod, as if agreeing with something she hadn't said out loud. "My full name is Colton Rhodes. I'm from a town up in Montana. I was raised in the country, learned to work with animals since I was a kid. About 3 years ago, I had a business with a partner, a cattle business. The partner started making decisions I didn't know anything about, running up debt on what belonged to both of us, and when the trouble showed up, he vanished, and I was left holding the bag." Savannah didn't blink. "What was your partner's name?" Colton looked at her with an expression she couldn't read at first. Why does that matter? It could matter a lot. He was silent for a moment, like someone weighing whether the question deserved an answer. Then he said the name, and Savannah felt a chill run down her neck. The last name was different, but the first name was Harrison. She didn't let anything show on her face. She asked a few more things, listened carefully, and left with her head spinning. It could be a coincidence. Harrison was a common name. But her gut said it wasn't. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch looking out at the darkness of the ranch, listening to the sounds the night made in the fields, thinking about everything she knew and everything she still needed to find out. And then she started putting the pieces together. There was one thing she'd never been able to fully understand. Right after Mr. Arthur had passed, Harrison had shown up with documents claiming the ranch had an old outstanding debt. A debt Mr. Arthur had never mentioned to anyone. Savannah had questioned it, but the papers seemed to be in order. She had spent months paying it off little by little, sacrificing more than she could afford. Could that debt have had something to do with an old business deal? Did Harrison have a habit of showing up with collections for people who were no longer in a position to question them? She needed to know, and she was going to find out. Over the next 2 days, Savannah talked to people in town, quietly, without making a fuss. She talked to the owner of the general store, who had heard just about everything for decades. She talked to an elderly man who had worked with cattle his whole life and knew the business stories of the surrounding area. And what came to light was like a mosaic that at first didn't make sense, but piece by piece formed a picture too clear to ignore. Harrison had a pattern. He'd go into business with people who had less influence than him, put in money, let the other person do the work, and when things started going well, he'd create situations from the inside until the business turned into chaos. Then he'd slip away, leaving the other person to fend for themselves. The name Colton Rhodes had come up in a conversation the general store owner had overheard years before, a man who had passed through the region with cattle, who was trying to rebuild what he had lost after being abandoned by a partner, who'd vanished with everything good and left the complications behind. It was him. There was no way it wasn't. But Savannah didn't stop there. She spent a whole night digging through her father's office files, the old folders, the papers with yellowed edges that no one had opened since Mr. Arthur. And she found in a thin folder at the back of a drawer a sheet of paper in her father's handwriting, a short note written with the pen he always used. "Harrison B. doesn't have what he claims to have. Be wary." Her father knew, or suspected at least, and he had never gotten there in time to tell her. Savannah stood looking at that piece of paper for a long time. She folded it carefully and went to get Mrs. Martha. Her aunt listened to everything without interrupting. When Savannah finished, she stayed silent for a moment, her eyes resting on some distant spot in the kitchen. Then she said, "I knew the Rhodes family. Your father did business with that young man's father years ago when you were children. Serious people. People of their word." Pause. "If the son says he was betrayed, I believe him. But I still don't know if it's the same Harrison." "Then your next conversation is with Harrison himself, and see what he does when he hears Colton's name." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Savannah didn't have to wait long. Harrison showed up 2 days later unannounced with his usual smile and the same 2 men behind him. He came in through the porch like someone walking into his own place and got straight to the point before even sitting down. "Savannah, this whole thing with that ranch hand has gone too far. The whole town is talking. You can't seriously be thinking about honoring a promise to a man who showed up out of nowhere with no name, no land, nothing." She let him finish. She stood there, arms crossed, brown hat on her head, looking at him without blinking. "First," she said with a calm she had built over 2 difficult days, "the man has a name, Colton Rhodes. Second, the promise is mine and I decide what I do with it." Harrison let out a short laugh. "Rhodes, you know the drifter's name, but you don't know the story." "I know more than you think." He waited. "I know he had a partner who disappeared when the business went south," she continued, her voice steady. "And tell me something, Harrison. Does that partner happen to be named Harrison by any coincidence?" The silence that fell there lasted maybe 3 seconds, but they were 3 long seconds. Harrison's smile disappeared. The 2 men behind him exchanged glances, not understanding. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. His voice had changed. It had lost its usual smooth veneer. "Yes, you do." Savannah took a step toward him. "Just like you knew about the claim you filed after my father passed. Neatly arranged documents, Harrison. But my father left notes too." The silence returned, heavier this time. "You don't have anything that proves anything," he said at last. "I have enough to ask the right questions at the right times." She held his gaze without flinching. "And you know better than I do that questions sometimes are enough." Harrison stared at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It wasn't anger. It was the assessment of someone realizing the ground had shifted. After a moment, he picked up his hat, gave a single nod, and left. Without a word. Without the fake smile. The 2 men behind him, not understanding any of what had just happened. Savannah stood at the porch entrance until the car disappeared into the dust of the road. Then she took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and felt her shoulders drop on their own. There was one knot that still needed to be untied, the most important one. She went to the corral. Colton was there, as always, keeping midnight company with that calm presence the horse had learned to recognize. Savannah approached and leaned against the fence from the outside. "I need to tell you some things," she said. He turned, waited. Savannah told him everything, the pattern she had discovered about Harrison, the suspicion that he was the same man who had been his partner, her father's note, what the owner of the general store had confirmed. She told it without embellishment, without holding back, without leaving any gaps. Colton listened in silence. When she finished, he stayed quiet for a while, looking at midnight. Then he closed his eyes for a second, like someone swallowing something heavy. "This wasn't what I expected to find here," he said. "I know. I didn't know any of this when I showed up at the gate. I came because I needed work." "I know that too." Another pause. Midnight shook his mane in the corral, calm as he only was when Colton was near. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Savannah straightened up. "I'm going to contest the claim he filed after my father left. I have my father's note and what the general store knows. It may take time, but it will be contested." Pause. "And you can also request a review of what happened with your business. With a name and dates, it can be looked into." Colton nodded slowly, considering. Then he looked at her. "And the promise?" That was it. That was exactly it. Savannah looked at him for a while before speaking. She wasn't one to beat around the bush, but that moment called for care. "The promise was made without thinking, but it was made in public, and my father taught me that a word carries weight." She crossed her arms. "I'm not going to hold you to anything, and you don't owe me anything. But I want to be honest. I never married my whole life because I never found anyone who seemed real. And you seem real." Colton kept looking at her. "I'm not going to ask you to stay because of the promise," she went on. "But if you want to stay, there's work, there's a place, and we get to know each other the way it deserves to be, without rushing." A corner of his mouth lifted, discreet like everything about him, everything. "Starting like that, I accept," he said. "I had to take a deep breath right here, because there are few things more beautiful than two people finding each other with no pretense at all." Mrs. Martha, who had appeared at the kitchen window without making a sound, went back inside pretending she hadn't seen anything, but she was smiling. In the following weeks, the ranch began to change in a way that is hard to put into words, but that everyone who lives in a place notices. It's in the smell of the morning, in the way the animals settle when the routine is in order, in the sound of two voices talking on the porch after dinner, where before there was only one. Colton stayed. He worked, and he showed with his hands what any conversation would be too long to explain. There was a care in the way he handled things, in the animals, in the fences he fixed without being asked, in the way he asked Savannah how she was on the days she seemed weighed down. A care that said more about who he was than any story told. Mrs. Martha slowly traded her appraising look for respect, and respect over time became affection. She started keeping an extra plate on the stove, asking how he had slept, including him in the stories she told on the porch, the way you include someone in a memory that is still being formed. Once, on an afternoon that smelled of rain coming, Mrs. Martha said to Savannah, as the two of them folded sheets in the hallway, "Your father would have liked him." Savannah didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The matter of the financial claim Harrison had presented was handled calmly, with documents and with the help of people from Abilene who knew the stories of more than one generation. It wasn't fast, it wasn't simple, but it got resolved. What was Savannah's remained hers, and Colton, once he gathered enough documentation of what had happened to his business, took the necessary steps to leave that weight behind in whatever way was possible. He didn't recover everything, but he came out of it with his head held high, which sometimes is what counts. Harrison Brooks stopped showing up at the ranch. Abilene, which loves a good story, kept finding others to tell, and Savannah's promise became, over time, one of those stories people remember with a crooked smile, the kind of story that seems made up but actually happened. One afternoon, close to dusk, when the sky was that shade of orange that only shows up on good days, Savannah went to the corral with her hat in her hand. Midnight saw her coming and slowly, without any hurry, walked over to the fence and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. She stood still. Her heart raced for a second. Then she ran her hand slowly along the horse's dark neck. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's okay." Colton was standing a little ways behind her without making a sound. She turned and saw him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "He accepted you," he said at last. "Took him long enough," she replied. "The things worth having always take a little while." Savannah looked at him. Then she turned her face toward the orange horizon, her brown hat in her hand, midnight quiet at her side, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like the ranch was whole again. End of story. This story stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Savannah with that steadiness that covers an exhaustion she never showed anyone, Colton with that silence that said more than a lot of talk, and Mrs. Martha keeping an extra plate on the stove without needing to explain why. There's something about it that feels a lot like real things. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Savannah made the right choice in taking it slow, without rushing, without pushing? Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? What city? What state? I read every single one. And if you made it this far, you already know what I need. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for keeping me company today.